The slap came before anyone in the ballroom understood who they were slapping, and by the time they did, it was already too late to matter. It happened fast. A raised hand, a crack of sound, sharp enough to cut through the string quartet, and then a stillness so total that the room seemed to forget how to breathe. No one moved to help, no one said her name, because at that moment, almost no one in that room actually knew it. They would learn it soon enough. They would spend the rest of that year learning it, turning it over, saying it in boardrooms and law offices and quiet family dinners where no one could quite look at each other. But in that first frozen second, she was only a woman in a black dress, standing very still with her hand rising slowly to touch her own cheek. And the family who had just struck her had no idea they had just detonated the most expensive mistake of their lives. 31 seconds later, a phone call ended a deal worth $950 million. The woman who made that call did not raise her voice once. Her name was Corinne Ashworth, and if you had passed her on a sidewalk in Savannah on any ordinary Tuesday, you would not have looked twice. She was 44 years old, unhurried in the way she moved, dressed that evening in a black gown with no ornamentation beyond a pair of small gold earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. She did not carry herself like a woman who needed to be recognized. She carried herself like a woman who had long since stopped needing anyone's permission to take up space, which is a very different thing, and far more unsettling to people who have built their entire identity on deciding who deserves to be in a room. She had not always moved like that. There had been a version of Corinne, 22 years old, standing in a laundromat in Macon, at 11 at night, doing the books for the beauty supply store she worked at, because the owner couldn't be bothered to learn the software, who would not have recognized the woman she'd become. That Corinne had eaten ramen for a week so she could put gas in a car with a check engine light that never went off. That Corinne had a business plan folded into quarters in her back pocket for 11 months before she worked up the nerve to walk it into a small community bank and ask a loan officer named Mr. Devereaux, a man who would later become one of the first people she called when the company went public, for $18,000 to build software that helped small manufacturers track their own supply chains without paying enterprise prices for tools built for companies 50 times their size. $18,000 became a company. The company became Solvane Systems. Solvane became over 22 years of decisions made mostly alone, in mostly quiet rooms, a firm valued at just under $35 billion, one of maybe a dozen tech infrastructure companies that most people had never heard of and every serious manufacturer in the country depended on completely. Corinne kept no publicist. She gave interviews rarely, and only when the outlet agreed the story would be about the company rather than about her, because she had watched too many founders, brilliant ones, one smarter than her by any conventional measure, fall in love with their own myth and lose the discipline that built it in the first place. She funded a scholarship program for young women out of trade schools and community colleges across the Southeast, quietly, anonymously, structured, so that not even the recipients knew where the money came from. She did this because she remembered, with total clarity, what it felt like to need $400 and not have it, and to watch that number rearrange the entire shape of what felt possible. The invitation to the Ashcombe Foundation Gala had come through her chief of staff 5 weeks earlier. On its surface, it was a fundraiser for a new pediatric wing at Savannah Memorial, hosted at the Ashcombe family's restored plantation-turned-event estate on the river. An evening of orchestra music and oysters, and checks written for the optics of writing them. Corinne had agreed to attend for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the hospital wing, though she believed in the cause and had already quietly funded 2 of its exam rooms herself, unattributed, the way she funded most things. The real reason was seated 2 floors above the ballroom, inside a folder her legal team had prepared. The final terms of Solvane's acquisition of Ashcombe Textile Group, a 140-year-old manufacturing firm that had once employed 9,000 people across 3 states and now employed just under 1,000, bleeding money for 6 straight years under a board, too proud to admit the family that ran it hadn't kept pace with the industry it used to define. The deal was worth $950 million. It had taken 14 months of negotiation, 4 rounds of due diligence, and the patient, unglamorous labor of nearly 60 professionals across 2 firms. The signing was scheduled for 9 the next morning. The gala was meant to be the friendly bookend before the formal handshake. A chance, as the Ashcombe family's event planner had put it in an email Corinne's chief of staff had forwarded her, for both families to break bread before we make it official. Corinne had agreed to attend in person, without an entourage, because she believed, the way she believed very few things without qualification, that you could learn more about a person's character in 90 minutes at a party than in 90 hours across a negotiating table, because a negotiating table is a stage and a party is not. She had learned this, the expensive way, years earlier, from a partnership that had looked flawless on paper and had collapsed within 18 months because the people on the other side of it treated their own employees the way you'd treat furniture, and Corinne had not caught it in time because she'd only ever met them in rooms where they were performing. She would not make that mistake twice. So she came to the gala alone, in a black dress with no logo and no entourage, and she walked through the estate's front doors at 7:45 without announcing herself to anyone, because she wanted, more than anything else that evening, to simply watch. The Ashcombe family had occupied a particular altitude of Savannah society for 4 generations, and Eleanor Ashcombe had spent the better part of 30 years acting as its unofficial keeper. She chaired the gala committee. She knew, with the confidence of long practice, exactly which family's money was old enough to matter and which was merely large. She was 58, precise in her movements, the kind of woman who could compliment your dress and somehow make it clear she was doing you a favor. She did not think of herself as a snob. She thought of herself as a curator of standards, and the distinction in her mind was not only real but virtuous. Her husband, Walter Ashcombe, was 62 and had inherited the textile company from his father at 34 with the quiet, unspoken understanding that his job was not to build something new but to not lose what had already been built. For a long time that had been enough. He sat on hospital boards and university boards and had shaken enough hands at enough dinners over enough decades that his position in the world had come to feel, from the inside, like something he'd earned through sheer steadiness rather than something that had simply never been seriously tested. The last 6 years had tested it. Overseas competition, an ill-timed factory modernization that drained capital reserves, 2 lawsuits from a supplier dispute that had cost more to settle than to win. The company Walter's grandfather built was, by the night of the gala, 3/4 carrying debt that would take a miracle or an acquisition to survive. And Walter knew, in the specific and private way a man knows something he has not said out loud to his own son, that without Sylvain's money, Ashcombe Textile would not exist in 18 months. Their son, Preston, 29, held the title of Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, a role that had been created for him the year he graduated business school and had never involved anything resembling strategy. He spent most of the gala near the bar, discussing golf. None of the Ashcombes knew what Corinne Ashworth looked like. They had corresponded, over 14 months, entirely through lawyers, bankers, and a small circle of deal executives. In Walter's mind, an image had formed anyway, assembled out of nothing but the weight of the number attached to her name, a picture built from assumption rather than evidence. The way people who have never had to question their assumptions tend to build them without noticing they're doing it. He had pictured someone older, more severe, flanked by advisors, the kind of executive who would arrive with security and leave within the hour. He had not pictured a woman standing alone near the dessert table in a plain black dress, turning a glass of sparkling water slowly in her hand, watching the room the way you'd watch weather roll in. Eleanor noticed her first. It was nothing at first. A flicker of attention, the reflexive scan Eleanor performed on every unfamiliar face in a room she considered hers to arrange. The woman in black was standing near the entrance to the section reserved for the evening's largest donors and the hospital board, a section Eleanor had personally organized down to the seating cards. She did not recognize the woman's face from any list she'd memorized, and Eleanor Ashcombe did not forget faces attached to money, which meant, in the particular logic she had never once had cause to interrogate, that this woman did not belong there. She crossed the room with the unhurried authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm sorry," she said, in a voice pitched for politeness but carrying something underneath it that wasn't. "This section is reserved for our principal donors. Can I help you find your table?" Corinne turned to face her without any visible reaction beyond attention. "I believe I'm seated here," she said. "I organized this seating myself," Eleanor said, and there was the faintest edge now, the tone of someone repeating a fact she considered self-evidently sufficient. "I'd remember." Corinne reached into the small clutch at her side and produced her place card, cream-colored, her name printed in the same script as every other card at that table. Eleanor took it, glanced at it for exactly as long as it took to decide. It changed nothing about her conclusion, and handed it back. "There may have been an error with the printing," she said. "It happens more than you'd think, with a guest list this size. I'll have someone from staff find you a seat in the general section. It's lovely. It's just past the—" "I confirmed my seat 3 weeks ago," Corinne said, and her voice had not changed at all. Not in volume, not in temperature. "I'm comfortable waiting here while you check, but I don't see a reason to move." Something in that response, the calm of it, the total absence of the apology Eleanor had been expecting, maybe even counting on, seemed to shift something in her. People who are used to being deferred to develop a very specific reaction when deference doesn't arrive on schedule, and it is rarely a reaction that reflects well on them. Eleanor's voice sharpened. She said something about how these events required a certain order, that surely the woman understood, that this wasn't personal. She reached out and closed her hand around Corinne's forearm, not violently, but with a grip meant to communicate that the conversation and Corinne's presence in that section were both about to end. Corinne looked down at the hand on her arm, and then back up. "Please take your hand off me," she said. Still no rise in her voice. Still no tremor. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, and it was witnessed, later estimates would suggest, by close to 50 people, and captured on at least a dozen phones. Eleanor released Corinne's arm, and then, in a motion that seemed to arrive from somewhere far older than the moment itself, from some deep well of certainty that had simply never once been challenged in 58 years, she slapped her. The sound cracked through a lull in the music and seemed to hang in the air a half-second longer than a sound should. Every conversation within 30 feet stopped mid-sentence. A server froze with a tray raised. Nobody moved toward either woman. Nobody said a word. Corinne stood completely still. She lifted 2 fingers to her cheek, not as a gesture of pain, but something closer to confirmation, as though she were checking a fact against her own memory of it. There was no visible anger on her face. There was, if anything, an almost unbearable stillness, the look of a woman who had received a great deal in her life that she had not deserved, and had long ago learned that the moment right after receiving it belonged entirely to her, and that spending it on a reaction was a kind of theft from herself. Walter arrived at his wife's side within moments, drawn by the sudden silence rippling outward from the spot. He said, low enough that only a handful of people caught it, that Eleanor had probably been right to hold her ground, that events like this needed someone willing to maintain order. Corinne heard him. She gave no sign that she had. She stood in the exact place the slap had landed for another few seconds, as if moving from it would suggest she'd been displaced. Then she opened her clutch, took out her phone, and made a call that lasted 11 seconds. Almost no one nearby could make out the words, except for the 2 closest to her, who would later describe them, separately, in almost identical language. Pull the signing. Effective now. She ended the call. She put the phone away. She walked to her seat, sat down, and picked up the dinner menu, reading it with the unhurried attention of a woman deciding what she might like to eat. 3 floors up, in a suite Solvain's legal team had reserved for the duration of the evening, the call was received by a man named Elias Nkemelu, Corinne's general counsel of 11 years, who understood from the exact length of her pause before speaking that this was not a decision open for discussion. He asked no questions. He made 2 calls of his own within 4 minutes, one to the lead deal attorney, one to the financing partner backstopping the acquisition. And by the time the appetizer course was being cleared from tables across the ballroom below, the $950 million acquisition of Ashcombe Textile Group had been formally suspended, not delayed, not paused for reconsideration. Suspended, with a note in the file that said the decision had come directly from Solvain's CEO. There was a 3rd call Elias made that night, one that hadn't existed in any version of this story before. A call to a friend of his who practiced criminal law in Chatham County to ask, in the most procedurally correct language he could manage at 11 at night, what the process looked like for filing a formal report regarding an unprovoked physical assault at a private event with multiple witnesses. Corinne had not asked him to make that call. She had simply, in the 11-second phone call from the ballroom, said one more sentence after pull the signing, one that Elias had written down word for word, and document everything, all of it, every witness. He understood what she meant without her spelling it out further. Whatever else this cost the Ashcombs, it would not be allowed to disappear into a story about an evening that got out of hand. The Ashcombs did not learn any of this immediately. Walter had returned to a conversation at the bar. Eleanor had rejoined a cluster of women near the floral arrangement, describing the incident in the tone of someone who'd successfully resolved a minor staffing error. Preston was on the terrace, discussing a golf trip to Hilton Head. The unraveling began with a man named Foster Wren, a senior partner at the bank financing part of the acquisition, who stepped away from a conversation to check his phone and went very still. He crossed the room quickly and found Walter at the bar. He leaned in close. "The deal's gone," he said. Walter laughed, the short, involuntary laugh of a man certain he'd misheard. Then he looked at Foster's face and stopped. "Gone how? Pulled, 14 minutes ago. Directly from their CEO. She's." Foster hesitated, and something in the hesitation made the hair on Walter's arms rise before the sentence finished. "She's here, tonight. She's been here the whole time. Ashworth is here?" Walter said. "Where?" Foster didn't answer right away. He was looking across the room, toward the front tables, toward a woman in a black dress, sitting alone, reading a dinner menu with a stillness that, from this distance and with this new information, suddenly looked like something else entirely. Walter's understanding assembled itself the way understanding does after a car accident. Slowly, in pieces, the full shape of it, arriving only after the smaller shocks had already done their damage. He had spent 14 months negotiating with a name on documents, and had never once connected that name to a face, because somewhere in those 14 months he had quietly decided, without ever admitting it to himself, that a woman with that much power would send a delegate to something as trivial as a charity dinner. He had built an entire mental picture out of nothing but assumption, and the woman his wife had just struck did not match it. Not because Corinne had done anything to disguise herself, but because Walter's imagination had simply never made room for the possibility. That was the part that would stay with him longest. Not that his wife had made an error, that he had made the same one first, silently, before Eleanor ever crossed the room. He walked toward Corinne's table with the specific, desperate purposefulness of a man trying to outrun a consequence that had already caught him. He'd rehearsed something in the 30 seconds it took to cross the ballroom. A sequence of phrases meant to sound humble while leaving a door open. He reached her table and said her name, full name, with a formality that arrived about an hour too late to mean anything, and told her there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that his wife hadn't known who she was. Corinne let him finish. Then she set down the menu. "I understand what you're trying to say," she said, "and I don't doubt you believe it's true. But You should know, the fact that your wife didn't know who I was isn't actually the problem. She paused, not for effect, but the way a person pauses when they want to be certain of the shape of what they're about to say. The problem is what she did to a stranger she believed she could get away with treating that way. If I'd been exactly who she assumed I was, someone with no name attached to 9 figures, no leverage, nobody's attention, would tonight have gone any differently for that woman, or only for me? Walter opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out of it. That's not a rhetorical question, Corinne said evenly. I'd genuinely like you to think about it, because the answer tells you everything I need to know about the kind of partnership this would have been. Eleanor had followed her husband across the room, and now stood a few steps behind him, her face draining of color in a way that had less to do with shame than with the sudden, vertiginous sense of a world rearranging itself beneath her. She started to say something that began with what you have to understand. The beginning of an explanation that would have tried, one more time, to make the moment about a mistaken identity rather than a choice. Corinne looked at her for exactly as long as it took to register the sentence, then turned back to Walter. If this is how your family treats people you believe don't matter, she said, I can't build a $950 million partnership on that foundation. Foundations reveal themselves in rooms like this one, not in the ones with lawyers in them. She picked the menu back up. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was finished. The consequences arrived with the particular speed of something that has been quietly ready to happen for a while. Legal notice of the suspended acquisition reached Ashcomb's counsel before midnight. Chatham County Police took a statement from Elias the following morning, supported by video from at least 4 separate phones, and 2 days later Eleanor Ashcombe was formally charged with simple assault, a fact that, when it eventually reached the local paper, generated more coverage than the failed acquisition itself. Because a woman like Eleanor being charged with anything was, in Savannah's particular social ecosystem, close to unthinkable. She would eventually accept a plea agreement involving a fine, mandated community service, and a formal, public acknowledgement of the incident. Not the kind of consequence that satisfies everyone who hears the story, but a consequence, documented, on the record, in a way that the version of this story circulating a year earlier had conspicuously lacked. The financial fallout was worse, and slower, and in some ways crueler for how ordinary it looked from the outside. 2 institutional lenders reviewed their exposure to Ashcombe Textile within the week and didn't like what they found once the acquisition was off the table. The company's board, blindsided and furious in a way that had nowhere useful to direct itself, began exploring a restructuring that would leave the family with a minority stake and no controlling vote. Walter spent the better part of that year in a state that people who'd known him for decades quietly described as grief. Not for the money specifically, though the money mattered, but for a story about himself he'd never had reason to question until the night it collapsed in front of 200 witnesses. Eleanor did not speak publicly about the incident beyond the required statement attached to her plea. Those closest to her said the silence wasn't peace. She had spent 30 years trusting her own read of a room, certain that instinct and judgment were the same thing, and that certainty had failed her in the most public and expensive way imaginable. Whether it changed anything in her, beyond the fact of the consequence, was not something anyone, including her, seemed able to answer honestly. Corinne addressed it once, 10 days later, in a short meeting with her leadership team, without ceremony, and without turning it into a speech about anything larger than what it was. She thanked the deal team for 14 months of real work on an outcome that hadn't landed and told them to find the next candidate. Solvane closed a smaller acquisition 8 months later, a mid-sized manufacturer in the Piedmont, with a leadership team she'd met with 3 separate times in person before deciding they were people worth building something with. There was no gala. There was a conference room and a handshake and a set of signed documents, and the integration, by every measure that mattered, went well. 9 months after the gala, Walter Ashcombe requested a meeting through intermediaries with no legal agenda attached. Corinne agreed, because she believed in finishing things properly, and because she'd learned that a conversation left unfinished tends to take up more room in your attention than it deserves. They met in a small conference room at a law office in Savannah's historic district. Just the two of them, water on the table, no one else present. Walter said he'd spent the better part of a year trying to understand not just that night, but the years of habit and assumption that made it possible. His, as much as his wife's. He said he wished they'd met under different circumstances. He said it plainly, without performance, and it was, Corinne thought, the most honest thing she'd heard from him. She considered it for a moment before answering. "We did meet under the right circumstances," she said, finally. "Your family just happened to show me the truth a little earlier than I would have found it otherwise. I'd rather have it that way than sign something with people I didn't actually know yet." She said it without malice, and without any satisfaction either, the way a person states something they've already made peace with. Walter nodded. He didn't argue with it. There wasn't much left to say after that. She stood, shook his hand, and walked out into the late afternoon light, back toward an office where there was always something waiting to be built, because building, for Corinne Ashworth, had never once been about proving anything to a room. It had only ever been about the work, the part that outlasts every room it's ever been underestimated in, long after the people who did the underestimating have had to learn better, whether they wanted to or not.